All right, so I'm really excited to welcome our keynote speaker onto stage right now. I'll just have him turn his camera on. Perfect. So we're really happy to and excited to welcome our keynote today, Dr. Kurt Dreisilker. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing your name correctly. So Dr. Dreisilker is the head of the Natural Resources and Collections Horticulture at the Morton Arboretum in Lisle, Illinois, where he plans and implements ecological restoration and horticultural maintenance programs. Kurt's work with public gardens has provided him with a unique perspective on plant invasions, since plants from around the world are utilized in many capacities throughout the Arboretum programs. He's also the treasurer for the Midwest Invasive Plant Network, and Kurt has a BS in plant biology and an MS in natural resources and environmental sciences from the University of Illinois. And in this presentation, Kurt will tell us more about the Public Gardens as Sentinels Against Invasive Plants working group. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to Kurt.
Okay, thank you so much, Emily. Welcome, everybody. Good morning. I'm beaming live from Lisle, Illinois, where the Morton Arboretum is located, about 40 kilometers west of Chicago. So I hope that some of you have at least been here to visit. If not, then please come and visit. So we are open 365 days a year, so we'd love to have you. So as Emily introduced me, she explained that my role is focusing in natural resources here at the Arboretum and then also in collections. And so I have sort of like an unusual perspective, perhaps, about plants as they move around in a garden environment. We are a public garden, we're an Arboretum, and there are about over 500 of them across North America. And so there are a lot of us, a lot of places like us in the region, if you will. And so I'm going to present to you about the Public Gardens as Sentinels Against Invasive Plants working group that we've been developing and propelling over the last few years. So, and I must say that this is my first time on Remo, so this is pretty neat. I actually feel like, since I can see icons down on my screen here, I actually feel like I'm engaged in front of an audience. So this is pretty neat for me. So here we go. So Morton Arboretum. Here we are just showing just a couple of images. As I mentioned, we're open all year long. So we have all these landscapes, trees and shrubs and other plants planted throughout the landscape. We're about 1,700 acres, or probably just shy of 700 hectares in area. So we have a pretty extensive area for people to come out and enjoy. We are an arboretum, so that's really an outdoor museum of trees. That's basically what it boils down to. And so this is what our kind of bread and butter is here at the Arboretum. So we have tree collections. We have over 222,000 living plants within our collections. We have 9,200 accessions, which are just ways that we organize these collections. They come from 42 different countries around the world, mainly the temperate northern hemisphere, where we can share climate similarities. And so these plants actually survive here. And of course, we might be thinking in this audience about some of these plants becoming invasive, but we're really an organization focused on conservation. And so we have 279 threatened plant species, I should have said there, that come from different parts of the world and are threatened at various levels. And so we do a lot to bring those threatened trees into our collection, sort of as a backup to what might happen, or hopefully what doesn't happen with trouble in their home range. And so we have these plants planted within our own collections here. So this is one of the important components of what we do. So the Morton Arboretum was founded 100 years ago. Just last month, we celebrated our official 100th anniversary. So here is Joy Morton. If you've heard of the company Morton Salt, then there is a connection there. So Joy Morton was the founder of Morton Salt, and was also the founder of the Morton Arboretum. So December 14th, 1922, which was 100 years ago and about a month. That's we're 100 years old, I guess is the bottom line here. And our mission, which I'll read to you here, is to collect and study trees, shrubs, and other plants from around the world, to display them across naturally beautiful landscapes for people to study and enjoy, and to learn how to grow them in ways that enhance our environment. Our goal is to encourage the planting and conservation of trees and other plants for a greener, healthier, and more beautiful world. And I'm just going to pause and just reread that in my mind and just remind myself that there is no reference to invasive plants or introducing invasive plants in this mission statement. So the work that I'm going to talk about today will focus on invasive plants, but nowhere in our mission, and I venture to say that nowhere in any garden's missions will there be anything about introducing invasive plants. But sort of representing the garden industry here for a second, there are times when people might point at us and say, hey, you used to have, and insert invasive plant name here, insert that species into the conversation. So you used to have that in your collections or in your gardens, or may still have that for some reason. And so there's a bit of sensitivity there. And so I'm here to explain what we're doing now to focus and advance on this initiative. And so I'll start off, again, focusing 100 years ago, and I'm using this plant species here, and that you can see in the image on the bottom left. You probably recognize that as Oriental bittersweet, or Celastrus orbiculatus. That is the plant of the topic here. And this article is actually taken from an unnamed botanic garden that I will not name. But this article was produced in 1922, and it was about this particular species within the botanic garden. Okay, so this plant was introduced, and then they published that within a few years, large tangled masses of bittersweet appeared on shrubbery and rocks nearby. The casual observer expressed surprise at the abundant growth of the shrubbery bittersweet in the garden area. And then it goes on to talk about how they identified it, and then they kind of conclude by saying this color scheme is appreciated by the various birds, and they're not slow in taking advantage of this food supply, and consequently scattering the seeds, which start new colonies of the vine where they may rest after a time after feeding. And so this process that is being described here, we're familiar with, in dispersal of seeds and how plant populations grow and ultimately can become invasive. And so this is, well, if we only knew back then what this plant could do. Oriental bittersweet in the range in the population today, we can see represented here, of course, with these green shaded regions. The population has spread throughout much of the US and into Canada. And, so if we'd only taken action 100 years ago, right? So hindsight is 2020. I don't mean to imply by pointing out this one unnamed garden that garden actually caused this. Of course, the plot is thicker than that, and it's a little bit more complex. So there's a lot more to the story of Oriental bittersweet, but one garden could have a say and influence what might have happened, would we have known back then. And so this illustration is really meant to shadow or to describe what I'm here to talk about today. And of course, I have to include a couple images of what I've been dealing with here at Morton Arboretum. Years ago, we went in and severed the base of these vines as they were growing into the canopy of these trees in our woodlands. And then, much to my pleasure, we got to watch the upper parts of these plants desiccate, and you can see those remains there. So it is a big problem here, and we've been tackling it as we can as well. So I suspect that the audience that you in the audience today will know about the invasion curve, but we're typically focused on the plants as they're kind of on the right-hand side of this chart. So in other words, as time moves along, the populations grow, and then those populations take more to actually control. And so they take more time, more money, and more effort overall. And so this is sort of like on the right side in the red is more the typical situation of what we deal with when plants are considered invasive. And in the course of today's conversation and our effort overall with this initiative, we're going to focus more on the left side of this chart. So if you look at that blue arrow where it says introduction, we see that we're dealing with small numbers of plants that are just introduced into a landscape. We might think of that landscape as the property or the gardens, grounds, the collections and gardens within a property of a public garden. So we are charged with collecting and displaying a lot of these plants from other parts of the world in many cases. And so sometimes we deal with rather obscure species that are not really horticulturally used. They're not used in the industry, and they are just in small numbers within our collections themselves. So if they start to spread within the garden's property, we might be able to do something about that and think about eradication instead of mere control, as on the right side of the chart. So this public garden concept just notes that we're perfectly positioned as sentinels against invasive plants, really. We may have seen these situations happening across the years in the past, but we can now do something about that. And I think a lot of gardens are doing more about this these days. So how are we perfectly positioned? Well, we have this beautiful landscape. And you can see an aerial image of the Dawes Arboretum in Ohio. You can see all of the fantastic trees and shrubs planted throughout their collections. These plants are all known. They're intentionally planted into this landscape. Someone curates that collection, and the curator makes a decision about which plants are introduced and which ones may be removed over time. And there's lots of data that's associated with these particular plants. And you can see the image with the label on it, the names and the dates and locations. And there's all sorts of other data associated with these collections of plants. So we have lots of databases, and we have labels, we have this information, this wealth of information at our fingertips within the public garden community. And then we have the expertise, the botanical and horticultural expertise to understand what it is that we're seeing when or if plants are moving and escaping from cultivation. And maybe that could be an initial sign of a troubling trend. So if one garden is taking action, imagine if all the public gardens across the continent could take action. And then we could start to see and communicate about these particular plant species and maybe take action and influence the prevention of ultimately plant species so that they don't become invasive. So as I mentioned earlier, we have over 500 gardens across the continent. And so our initiative now is recruiting these gardens to do just this. So we came together. This is an image in 2016. We gathered at the Morton Arboretum, and this was sort of the launching point where we discussed how it is that we think about these situations as garden curators are finding these plants escaping from their own collections. And during this conversation, these 2 days, we asked a lot of questions, we discussed these situations, and we raised a lot of good points that need to be considered in developing this concept. And so out of this group, out of this meeting, we actually started a working group, and we call ourselves Public Gardens as Sentinels Against Invasive Plants. So it's kind of a mouthful, but that's our name, and I think it illustrates what we're after here. And so you can see a lot of the logos that are representing gardens and organizations that have been incredibly active and helpful in this initiative. And I want to recognize my friends from the Royal Botanical Gardens. I think they're in the audience as well today. So hello and welcome. So from this particular initiative, from this particular event back in 2016, we launched the official working group in 2018. And from there, we decided that we needed to do a little bit of foundation building and understand where gardens are. Where are they at with respect to this issue across the continent? And so we, several of us in the working group, traveled to discuss this sort of issue with the American Public Gardens Association. We had presentations and surveys that we gathered all of this information. This foundation building really started with the 2001 initiative hosted by the Missouri Botanic Garden in St. Louis, where they produced this declaration. It's known as the St. Louis Declaration, where they produced a code of ethics for different audiences, such as botanic gardens or landscape architects or others, like the industry, for example. And so this code of ethics for botanic gardens was actually part of our foundation, and we wanted to know what this called for. And the code of ethics, I'm not going to spend much time going through the details of it, but it was an important piece for us to build on, because it really told us what to do, but didn't give us a lot of detail on how to do it. And I think that's the next step that we're taking with this initiative, and putting more detail and a process into how to engage public gardens across the continent so that we can help prevent species from becoming invasive. So here's some of our survey work, survey results. We did these surveys with our audience of curators from public gardens. And so American Public Gardens Association helped us to launch these surveys. And we found out, after all, that 91% of gardens actually have observed plants escaping from cultivation. 91% of the gardens have observed. That's a significant number. 89% of the gardens control the non-native plant taxa when they're found spreading from cultivation. 89% of gardens thought it would be helpful to learn from other gardens which species escape from cultivation and are being removed from their living collections. So in other words, gardens wanted to know what's happening at other gardens. And the mechanism for sharing this information up until this point was really just sort of reaching out one-to-one, colleague to colleague, when we're at meetings or conferences or other means. But really there was no general shared platform to allow gardens to share this data with other audiences or just with other gardens. We also found that 65% of gardens actively remove non-native taxa that are spreading from cultivation. And so here we have a chart on the top that I've created from the Morton Arboretum's records, showing the number of deaccessioned specimens per year due to invasiveness. And we can see this number. I'll just tell you that it's over 300 accessions that we've removed up until 2015, when I sort of stopped tracking this. I should probably update it at some point. But you can see a fair number of plants have been removed already from our collections at the Morton Arboretum due to invasiveness. And note, it does go back to 1988 when we removed our first plant that was noted to be weedy. And that was kind of before we started using the term invasive. And then in the two images on the bottom, you can see, you might guess, the winged Euonymus elatus in full red fall color at a different garden, was removed and then replanted that same location in the image on the right with some other evergreen shrubs. And so you can see, I guess this just illustrates that gardens are starting to take action and have been taking action. But again, there's really no shared platform for gardens to share this information with each other. So what we did in 2019 is that we developed standards for gardens, because as we started talking to gardens, we realized that even though they are doing a lot of work in this kind of environment, they're doing it according to kind of their own manner, their own mechanisms. And so we wanted to make sure we can standardize how this should be done, and then we can develop ultimately larger trends out of this data in the long term. So we created these standards, and we called, here's a screenshot of those standards on the left. It's Guidelines for listing, categorizing, and sharing information on plant taxa spreading from cultivation at public gardens in North America. Okay, so it's a rather long title, but that's it. It describes what the document is. And so in that 17 or so page document, you can see what those standards are and what sort of implications they may have for gardens as they classify these particular species that are found spreading from cultivation. And so one of the key pieces of information in this document is this sort of chart or this graph on the right. We developed ranks for how to consider, or terms really, how to consider these plants when they are found spreading from cultivation. And so we noted initially that there were a lot of different terms being used, so we wanted to standardize what those terms are, and then also to define those characteristics so that we can all talk in the same language, really. And so just to quickly note, I'll point out that 3 of these 4, that would be invasive, potentially invasive, and watch list. Those 3 are actually based on observations within the garden. So these are situations when horticulturists, curators, naturalists, volunteers, other staff, or other members of the garden actually see these plants that are escaping from cultivation. And so these are real observations. These are not predictive models. These are not risk assessments. These are real observations. And so the 4th category is called assessed as invasive, and this is based on literature reviews. And we wanted to provide that category because we know that some gardens have scientists who are actively engaged in that, or people actually focused on producing those assessments. And so that's based on literature, not so much the actual observations of plants escaping. So I think the other couple things I wanted to point out about this is that these particular categories focus on the degree of infestation, or how much is spreading, the population within the garden that is, and how extensive it is, and then how spread out it is, and whether it's happening in cultivated or uncultivated parts of the garden. And it also takes into account the regional population as well, because some of these populations have already been spreading outside the garden boundaries, and due to other planting efforts in the region or spreading efforts, there may be that population. So we thought it was important to include that regional aspect in there as well. And then the final note on this is that the garden policies are also recommended that so if these plants, if they achieve kind of like the next level up, there are different policy implications where the garden would be expected or recommended to remove or deaccession those plants from their collection. And then finally, the website for our database and where you can find these guidelines is down on the bottom of the screen there. So hopefully you can make a note of that. And actually, I'm going to reach out to Emily. I think if you have that, maybe we can post that in the chat, or I can maybe do that later if we get a chance to. Okay, so now that we have standards, in 2020, what we decided to do was produce a database. So now we have the ability for this garden audience to share the information with each other. And so there's the website again. I welcome you to go check it out. The database is actually by registration only. So you can land on the homepage, you can get the guidelines that I just referenced, you can see that. But you won't actually be able to go into the database with a registration unless you're from the garden audience. If you're a public garden member or a curator of sorts, then you can get access to this. And that's really by design, because public gardens are a bit sensitive to releasing this information at large to the general public, at least with the names of the gardens associated with that. And so gardens are, this is feedback that we've gotten directly from the public garden community. And so we want to respect the garden community by keeping that their names and that sort of information private, but it still allows for public gardens to go in and see what other gardens are actually witnessing within their gardens themselves. Right now, I should point out that we are actually working on a way to get this data out beyond the like the registration process, and filtering some of that more sensitive data like garden names and some of that location-based data. So stay tuned, and we're working on that this year, for example. Okay, so after developing the database, we needed to have data in the database, and so this is where the other public gardens come into play. So the effort in 2021 was really to recruit more gardens to participate, and then have them adopt these guidelines and policies, and then actually get their data into the database itself. And so we have some. So while we're still young, we have 12 gardens that have entered data. We have 9 US states and Canadian provinces represented, and you can see, actually I'll show you in a second where they come from. And we have ongoing conversations with about 30 more gardens at the moment. So this is a really active initiative at the moment, and we're really excited about it. 725 records have been submitted using the PGSIP standards. So over 700 records have already been entered just from 12 gardens. So it's really telling us, just in that statistic alone, about the potential of this initiative. And so we can see our friend Celastris orbiculatus in the image on the left again, with the range as well. And I just wanted to give you an update on what that looks like as well. So we have 4 of the 12 gardens reporting on the Oriental Bittersweet. At the Morton Arboretum, I'm going to give you our name and our category rank because, I represent the Arboretum and I'm okay with that. But the Morton Arboretum considers it invasive, and probably not to the surprise of this audience. But 3 other gardens have been reporting it as well, one of which reports as invasive, and 2 of the other ones report it as assessed as invasive. So while this is just 4 gardens, it is sort of like the beginning of a trend about this particular species. And so while this one may not be as shocking to an audience like this, we're probably all used to dealing with Oriental Bittersweet, there are other plant species, other taxa in this database that might be more of interest and might not widely be considered invasive. And so I'm showing you another one that is probably familiar to some in this audience, but maybe not to everybody. And that's the Amur cork tree, the Philodendron amurense. And this one is reported from, 7 of the 12 gardens are reporting this one. And at the Morton Arboretum, we consider this potentially invasive. And then 6 of the other gardens reporting, 2 are considering it invasive, 1 potentially invasive, and 2 as watch list. And then we have 2 more calling it assessed as invasive. So you can see a wider distribution in our categories, actually filling up all 4 of those categories ranks that we've used, or that we've defined. So what other data do we actually record? We have some data that's always included. So we want to make sure that when gardens are entering this data, they're actually required to report some of this data. So on the left, you see that those fields, like the taxon name, the location, ranking, and then the collector, some of the information about the collector from that garden, and then GPS coordinates of the garden itself, not necessarily the population. And then we have other fields which are not required, but we would like to have this data as well. So some include management notes on behalf of the garden, the estimated number or biomass of the population, and the method of spread, the type, the seedling, whether it's juvenile or mature, habitat description, survey type, whether it's on-site, off-site, whether it came from on-site or off-site, and some other information there you can see. So we intended, I'm going to flip back for 1 second. We want to make sure that this is a process that gardens can actually incorporate into their operations over time. And so if they have to just include the first set of data on the left, then maybe they can come back at some point and enter or fill out the rest of the fields when they have time. So we wanted to make sure this was a manageable process for the gardens. So if you were just listening, I guess this is repetition, but we have 12 gardens already represented, 725. database entries, and we have 506 unique species. Okay, so that's still more detail that I didn't share earlier. 10 of which are reported to be cultivars, and this full list includes ornamentals and known invasives from trees, shrubs, vines, and herbs. And so you can see in this image on the right where those plants are actually coming from, which gardens or which states or provinces that are represented in our data so far. So you can see we're still young, but we're still at it, and we're still recruiting more gardens to participate. So I want to take you a little bit deeper into the data because I think the audience here will be interested in this. Again, this is the list of category ranks, and so this time they're color coded. So we have yellow as watch list, then orange as potentially invasive, and then for simplicity, I'm just calling invasive and assessed as invasive as the reds here. Okay. And so here is another snapshot of the data. Actually, I misspoke there. The assessed as invasive is white in this chart here. And so you can see each of the shaded states and kind of an arrow or a line calling out to a bar chart where the representative taxa are shown in the colors, as you can see. And so I'll just pick on the Morton Arboretum. Here from Illinois, you can see that the taxa listed with the red, orange, and yellow is actually our data. And so you can see we have taxa being reported from all those different categories. We actually don't do assessments, and so we don't have any white. There are other gardens that do that, and those are the white or almost missing data points. So I apologize for a bit of formatting issue here. But you can start to get a sense of what we can do with this data and show you what it is that we're capable of. So again, this is just kind of the early phase of data trend development. And I think as we get more data, more gardens participating, and then more data in the database, I think we'll see more significant results that will be more meaningful. But nonetheless, it is very exciting. Okay, so I shared with you one of the most common trees in our database, which is the philodendron, the Amur cork tree. That was represented by 7 of the 12 gardens. I'm going to go through another set of data here. 6 of the 12 gardens are actually reporting the chocolate vine. This is an ornamental that has been used, perhaps not widely in the trade yet, but it is being reported by 6 of the 12 gardens. This is Akebia quinata, and you can see that the boxes on the bottom of the image are mostly yellow, and that's because all of the gardens except for one are reporting it as watch list. And so there's the story to tell there. Okay, so unfortunately we don't have time to go into all the details of what that looks like, but you can reach out to me afterwards if you have any questions about that. So if we move down from 6 gardens to 5 of the 12 gardens, we can see that they're reporting, the Berberis thunbergii, Euonymus elatus, another species of Euonymus, Francula alnus, Rhamnus cathartica, and Ligustrum obtusifolium, and then Robinia pseudoacacia. And so you can see, I'll just leave this up here for a second, 5 of the 12 gardens are reporting all of these different species. And so they're reporting at some level. And so again, those boxes beneath each of the pictures represent the categories in which they are actually being reported. So now we can start to see some more interesting narratives developing, and we might even be able to pair this up with regulatory status, noting that in different regions or different states, provinces, where these are regulated or not regulated. Maybe they should be, perhaps. Okay, moving down, we have kind of another view. I'll show you this without the images this time. You can see kind of a summary of all the data that I showed you on the left. And then you can see the gardens that are reporting four of the 12 gardens are reporting all of those species on the right. And so you can see that the red, again, represents invasive as the category rank. Orange is potentially invasive, yellow is watch list. And then the assessed as invasive are those white boxes as well. Okay, moving down the list again, we have 3 of the 12 gardens are reporting all of these species. And so we can see that the list kind of grows as fewer and fewer gardens report these particular species. The list of species actually grows quite extensively. And so this is just another way of categorizing the data at the moment here. So we can see some familiar names. Perhaps some of these are less familiar or unfamiliar. Okay, so in 2022, last year, now that we're starting to get data being populated in the database, we wanted to take another step in our working group. We wanted to take another step in this initiative. We wanted to recognize that gardens across the continent need to be working together to create this data. But in order for us to really achieve our mission and help prevent some species from becoming invasive, we need to reach out to other stakeholders. And so we spent last year doing that. We reached out to nurseries, we reached out to propagators, invasive plant councils, and landscape architects. We wanted to know, we invited those different organizations to the Morton Arboretum in just this past November for another 2-day summit. And we wanted to talk about what this initiative is doing and how it is that we can connect our work with these different stakeholders. And this is, I think, where the success will lie in the future. This is another key step in that process. In order for these plants to stop, in order for us to really make a difference and break apart that invasion pathway, these audiences need to come together. And so we invited all these different audiences, leaders from these different groups, to come to the Morton Arboretum to talk exactly about that. And so we did that. So the image on the left is all of us. We had about 20 people coming from many different US states and Canadian provinces to talk through these issues. And so we met in the very same location where we did way back in 2016 to launch this whole initiative, which was neat for me and several others who were at the same meetings. But here are the groups that we actually invited. So we had American Society of Landscape Architects, the Illinois Green Industry Association, which represents the green industry across the state of Illinois. But we also had nurseries, both at the local level around Morton Arboretum, as well as focusing on more of a national level in the US. Invasive species councils from Illinois, Ohio, as well as the Canadian Council on Invasive Species were all in attendance. We had individual botanic gardens and arboreta represented, as well as the American Public Gardens Association, which represents sort of the industry-wide of the public garden sector. Members of government, and then we also had the International Plant Propagator Society join us. So we felt like this group was a really key group to getting this conversation going. And we were successful in achieving their attention and also getting their feedback. So this 2-day initiative was really meant to help make that connection between PGSIP and these audiences. So we wanted to talk through how those different organizations work and how we can help them in the process of doing their work. If it's industry, for example, the nurseries, we want to help them by not cutting into profit margins, for example. So if we can give out early enough notice, for example, years in advance on an early, maybe it's a watch list species, maybe they can build that knowledge into their business cycle and plan on it so that, the government wouldn't come in and regulate when they've got a full field stocked full of a particular species of concern. And so the conversations were really productive for the 2 days. We had presentations and good conversation. And so we have this document produced on the right, the summary and key findings that is out for review at the moment. And so we've just had this meeting in November, and so we produced the key findings and we sent it back out to our audience, the 20 or so of us that were in attendance. And so we will be seeking their feedback, and ultimately what we want to do is understand how to connect with these audiences. And then in order to be the most effective, what we're thinking is that we will issue an alert. And so this would be a PGSIP. This would be our working group issuing an alert. And this alert would be on a particular taxa, for example, to notify these different audiences about what we're seeing in the public garden community. And so hopefully, again, these different audiences can take that knowledge, take that information and data into their planning purposes to help prevent species from becoming invasive. And so this alert is kind of a big deal for us. And so we've not really finalized all the details of it. So I can't really say too much more about it, but we're excited that we can do this and that we're having these conversations. And I think that's where it's going to be really productive. Okay, just a couple more slides here. So in 2023, this year, as I mentioned, this alert, we're planning to issue an alert, our first one that will be coming forth. But also we still need to gather more data and recruit more gardens to participate in this initiative. So we have a significant level of effort focused on the eastern United States this year, reaching out to gardens in Pennsylvania and the mid-Atlantic coast and up into Ontario. So what can we do, or what can you do? If you are sitting in the audience today and you represent a garden from North America, you can join us. And we'd love to have you engage in the conversation, engage in the working group, or engage in the initiative at large. And so here's an email address. You can reach out to us, just pgsipadmin@mortonarb.org. As I've posted before, there's a website for more information about this initiative as well. If you're interested in keeping up with our working group overall, you can sign up for our newsletter. And actually, I will seek out Emily to see if she can help me post this link in the chat so that we can all have access to that as well. If not, I can try to do that after the presentation's over. But that link right there will actually take you to an opt-in form, and you can sign up for our newsletter. And we only send out about 2 every single year. So we're about to send out the 3rd one in the coming weeks. So hopefully you can find your way to that. And finally, if you're interested in reading a little bit more about our work, we did produce a couple of publications. The one here, kind of on the left, is from Biodiversity and Conservation, called the Potential Role of Public Gardens as Sentinels Against Invasive Plant Invasion. Get the title right there. That was just published last year. And then the other one from Public Garden Magazine from 2019, you can read a bit about the context of the working group and how we started as well. If you have any questions, I would invite you to the chat function, or maybe Emily, we can do our Q&A session, or even you can check out my email address and make note of that, and I'd be happy to correspond with you even after today.
Great. That was a really great presentation, Kurt. Your initiative sounds like it'll really help our fight against invasive plants, especially having them be introduced via horticulture and things like that. So we do actually have a couple questions for you. So the first one here, what was the first species your garden began removing?
Oh, the first species that the Morton Arboretum started to remove was a species of rhuus. Well, it's Toxicodendron now. So it was Toxicodendron vernicifluum, and it's the Chinese lacquer tree. I suspect that very few people in the audience will know it, but it is a Toxicodendron species. And so it is actually highly toxic to the touch. And so it was weedy. It was spreading around the immediate site where it was planted back in 1988 and earlier. And so we decided, the curator at the time decided to remove it because it was weedy and because it was toxic. And so we did that. So that was it. So I'd be curious to know, maybe a show of hands, if anybody's familiar with that particular species.
Great. I'll take time to just do one more question here, and then I will put the questions in the chat, and you can, if you want to correspond with our participants in the chat, we can do that as well. So the question here is, why is the information you presented considered sensitive to the public?
Yeah, well, so technically it's sensitive to the public gardens. And so the public gardens have, a wealth of knowledge, but we don't want to be perceived as like the people or the organizations to blame. And so I think there have been situations where this has happened in the past, plus the data that we actually have, which can be quite useful, hopefully, as I've described today. But we also don't want that data to be misinterpreted. Okay, so for example, some of the plants that we consider on our watch list, we don't consider invasive. So what we're describing here are plants that are at the beginning phase, perhaps, of this invasion curve, but they haven't quite reached the level where they're considered invasive at the moment. And so by publishing all of the data online, we're not sure how to make sure the data is not misinterpreted. And so we have come up through a lot of the conversation in our working group that the small populations of a particular species that's really unknown to the larger region, a small population of, I'm just going to say, a dozen seedlings does not equate to plant invasion. And so we're not going to consider that plant invasive. And so that's built into our definitions. And so, there is some sensitivity to that topic as well, because we don't want people to be overly concerned about something that may not be a concern. And at the same time, if it does produce a larger population over time, then that could be scaled up from the watch list rank to a higher category as needed. And then, of course, we could start using the term invasion at the appropriate time. And our effort, just to really emphasize the point, the effort behind this initiative is to stop plants from becoming invasive. And that's where I think the value of this initiative can really be fruitful, is that when we have these small populations, we can take action early, we can eradicate those small populations and just call it a day. And then we can communicate that information out to other sectors as needed. And then, other people, public gardens themselves don't regulate, we don't have that power, but we can communicate that information out and let people, take it from there.
Perfect. So in order to stay on time, that's the last question I'll be able to ask you live.